I wrote this lecture as a part of the course HNR 340, Making in the Maid, which is offered through the Renee Crown Honors Program at Syracuse University. This lecture is presented in 3 parts as 3 separate videos on YouTube. At the end of part 1, there's a link for part 2, which is this one. At the end of this part, there will be a link for the 3rd part. We're talking in these videos about plywood as a material, but more importantly, we're talking about plywood as a cultural indicator. I ended the last video by showing you this image. This is a diagram of 3 wing cores for this plane, the Havilland Mosquito. In 1941, this was the fastest operational aircraft in the world, and something like 1,500 of them were made for use in World War II. The reason they come into this lecture is that they were made in a factory like this. Yes, they were built out of plywood. In fact, many things in World War II were built out of plywood. Why? Well, because sheet after sheet after sheet of plywood can be generated, easily stacked, and then shipped anywhere in the world. The top left image on this slide is a famous PT boat, or patrol torpedo boat, hundreds of which were deployed throughout the Pacific Theater. On the top right is another type of boat, a landing craft used to shuttle soldiers from a larger boat to the shore. In fact, entire structures could be made out of plywood, and hundreds of barracks were constructed in both the European and the Pacific theaters to house soldiers. Once the structures were built, they were often furnished with plywood, as you can see in the bottom left image. That's a World War II-era footlocker, essentially just a plywood box. Easy to manufacture, cheap, and hundreds of thousands of these were made during World War II. But for furniture makers and designers, this is a huge object, one designed and made in World War II for World War II. The Eames Leg Splint. It's beautiful, isn't it? Made a huge change not only in how we think about plywood, but also in medical care during the war. You see, the existing leg splints were made out of metal, and they were so stiff that sometimes they would injure the patient more once they were on the back of a jeep bouncing away from the front lines than they had been in battle. Wife and husband design team Ray and Charles Eames designed this lightweight, strong splint that could be mass-produced out of several veneers. The bottom left image shows all of the layers. See how, from layer to layer, the grain orientation rotates 90 degrees? The bottom center image shows the press that molded the splint, and then the right-hand image shows the splint tied onto a soldier's leg. So in World War II, we were tooled up to produce a lot of plywood, both in sheets and in bent forms. Then, the war ended and everyone went home. In 1944, President Roosevelt signed into law the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly called the GI Bill. You may have heard of this. Among the benefits that the GI Bill promised to veterans were dedicated payments of tuition and living expenses to attend high school, college, or vocational technical school, low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans to start a business, and a year of unemployment compensation. In addition, we had all these factories tooled up to produce lots of plywood. They had to sell it to somebody. Coincidentally, we also had factories tooled up to make tanks and planes out of steel, and they needed something to make and sell as well. For the first time in history, in American history, young people could start out on their own, in their own house. Where are you going to build that house? The cities are too crowded already. So we came up with a new invention called the suburbs. The bottom image is an aerial view of one of the first suburbs in America, Levittown. People who could afford to do so moved to these new planned communities. Although the GI Bill did not specifically advocate discrimination, it was interpreted differently for black veterans than for white veterans. In his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, historian Ira Katznelson points out that because the programs were directed by local white officials, there is a de facto, if not officially sanctioned, discrimination against many veterans. For example, in the New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, about 67,000 mortgages were insured by the GI Bill, but fewer than 100 were taken out by non-white veterans. By 1946, only 1/5 of the 100,000 veterans of color who had applied for educational benefits had actually registered in college. Because of the inherent racism in the way the GI Bill was deployed, very few American soldiers of color were really able to feel much difference in their lives, and they mostly went back to wherever they had come from. All of those factories that were tooled up to make tanks and planes were now in the automobile business, and it so happened that cars were just exactly what everyone needed to get from their new houses in the suburbs into their jobs in the cities. This is a map created by Professor Colin Gordon at the University of Iowa. It tracks the movement of white people from the urban core, the red shows where they used to live, to the suburbs, the white shows where they moved to, which obviously far outstrips the number of people of color who moved out of the urban core in the same period. And this was true all over the country. And it remains true. The segregation hasn't gone away in St. Louis or in anywhere else. These images are taken from the racial dot map, which shows the racial makeup of every place that was recorded in the United States Census in 2010. It was compiled by researchers at the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at the University of Virginia, and I cannot recommend highly enough that you check it out. It can be really elucidating to zoom in on your own town, and you can zoom in pretty far. As you can see from the key, blue dots indicate people who in the 2010 census were recorded as white. Green dots indicate people who in the 2010 census were recorded as black. In every city in the nation, you will find this continued segregation, much of which was established immediately following World War II as the white veterans primarily bought homes or built homes out in the suburbs, and the veterans of color found themselves unable to get a mortgage to be able to do that. The map on the top left is Syracuse, and you can see how very segregated Syracuse is, but this is true everywhere. Here's a map of Baltimore, one of Atlanta, and one of Newark, New Jersey, a town that was particularly hard hit by white flight. None of this happened overnight, of course. Often it could take a decade, or in some cases even a few decades, to really see what happened, but it seems very clear from our vantage point, doesn't it? Some numbers about white flight indicate that even a non-white population of 5% can instigate white flight from a neighborhood, and this was originally made possible in part by the GI Bill and the rise of the suburb. Click on the link for Plywood in Context Part 3, in which we'll look at the repercussions of plywood on the American domestic landscape, and we'll wrap this lecture up.